Hello everybody. There are a great many reasons why when I have to do big mileages, I still prefer to drive, despite the fact it is something I do nearly every single day. And those include things like there are so many sights that you will see only if you are taking the road, places you can get to visit that are otherwise inaccessible. But one of my more obscure guilty pleasures is the fact you get to sample so many little local radio stations. And when I'm up here in Scotland, some of my favourites include the likes of Clyde One when I'm on the west coast, Central, and latterly Kingdom FM, and this morning Tay FM, which I have to say did put a big smile on my face as the two presenters were talking about their childhood fears. People were calling in and talking about that teacher they were always terrified of, or the one advert that still haunts their nightmares. But the exchange that really tickled me is the two presenters were talking, and I apologise, for the purposes of this, they're both going to be Americans doing a wonky Scottish accent and both blokes, although in actuality one was a gentleman and one was a lady. And the exchange went something like this. So, what's your fear? Oh, it's roller coasters, isn't it? Yeah, you don't like them? Well, I don't know. I've not actually really been on one. Well, you should. You should. Maybe you should go on a roller coaster. You see if you actually like it or not. Maybe you're no scared at all. Maybe I will. Maybe we can face our fears together. So mine's roller coasters. What's yours? Death. I don't know why, but that just killed me. Anyway, also on the channel today, the 2016 Jaguar XF V6S. So, this happens to be a fairly timely review for a couple of reasons. First off, my cheapo XJ that I acquired earlier in the year is going soon to be put to pasture, and in fact, by the time you see this video, it may already have been moved on. Meaning I need to find myself a semi-sensible four-seater, four-door car for the daily duty and all the boring stuff that I do in between filming. And you know what? There is actually an awful lot to be said for the practical, dependable and reliable car, which is why I'm probably going to do something really stupid like buying a dirt cheap Bentley or Range Rover. But as of yet, that decision is not even close to being made. There is, however, a possibility that I will buy another Jag, because I do really like the brand, and not just because it's British, but because it actually appeals to me in a lot of ways. You see, as a petrolhead, I am a real fan of the nice, classic, handsomely proportioned four-door saloon with a big meaty engine up the front. And this is a great example of that. And in so many ways, this car really is a creature out of time, because when the second generation XF, codenamed X260, launched back in 2015, the big meaty four-door saloon was just a car that Europeans were no longer buying. Instead, the previous buyers of cars like this had gone one of two routes, either into the small hatchback or the larger crossover and SUV market. And today, where stalwarts of the breed like BMW, Mercedes, Audi and Lexus still rely upon the classic four-door saloon for much of their income, many other brands have simply abandoned it entirely. And I think it's fairly safe to say that the companies which have stuck with the formula can do so because they still have a lot of customers in places like the United States, where it's still a fairly common formula. And indeed, there's an awful lot to be said about it. I recall reading an article a few years ago where one of the key designers of the then new BMW 3 Series said that he'd forgotten just how nice it was to build a regular, ordinary saloon car. He'd spent the last few years working on an increasingly large number of increasingly large SUVs, cars which are inherently compromised in terms of weight, packaging, dynamics, efficiency. Trying to make an SUV behave like a saloon is a very difficult job indeed. And there is basically no way to really make it happen without something being sacrificed. The humble, ordinary saloon car, though, it's perfect. It's smaller, it's lower to the ground, has a smaller frontal area, is naturally more dynamic, more efficient, a better driving car, and it's actually fairly easy to package. And of course, in with the ubiquitous saloon, I am also going to include, by proxy, the coupe, which Jaguar have never really dabbled with, save for their sports cars, and the estate, which on occasion they have. And tragically, though you could get the previous generation of XF in an estate, for this one, they didn't introduce it until 2018, when they facelifted the model range. And at that point in time, they made a few other changes, including ditching this 3-litre supercharged petrol V6, which is an engine that I've never been a huge fan of because of some rather serious engineering compromises, but it was, I think, a far more fitting engine to have in a Jaguar than the alternatives we were left with, which were a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo petrol and then the de facto range topper, a 3-litre V6 turbo diesel, which is in a lot of ways a perfectly decent engine, right up until the point that it breaks. However, for me, a Jaguar should always have at least the option of a nice, big, meaty petrol. And if you haven't experienced one, please do get your hands on one, preferably either naturally aspirated or, as we have here, supercharged. They are simply magnificent. And it's not about the headline figures, which here are 380 PS, 375 horsepower, and 332 pounds-feet of torque. That's 450 Newton-meters. Instead, what makes them for me so alluring is the way they make their power. They're easy, they're dependable, they're reliable, there is no turbo lag, there is no wait for the thing to decide whether it wants to give you power or not. When paired with this 8-speed ZF torque converter automatic, they did do the XF with a manual for a little bit, but it wasn't apparently very good. It just works, it just does the business. This is a car that you can sit in and instantly feel at home. It just does what you want it to. This generation of XF is notable too, because where its predecessor was built on a steel platform that is essentially an evolution of that used by the S-Type, this one had an all-new aluminium one, much closer related to that of the then current XJ, meaning that it was usefully lighter and, in theory, a little more dynamic too. Which makes it for me even more baffling, potentially borderline criminal, that for this generation of XF, Jaguar simply gave up on the idea of making a hot version. For the previous car, the X250, you had not only the regular XF available in early days as the SV8 with the 4.2-litre supercharged engine you would have got in the old XK and XJ, then later the 5-litre naturally aspirated V8, but also the XFR with its 5-litre supercharged V8, and at the end of production, even the mighty and madcap XFRS, which made some 550 horsepower. That is a criminally underrated car. It is an awesome piece of kit, and if ever you get the chance to sample one, you really must. But even the regular XFR is an awesome thing, a superb way to get from A to B, regardless of whether that is a 6-mile strip at the windiest, twistiest tarmac you know, or 500 miles across the Autobahn. The XFR is magnificent and everything that a Jaguar should be. But this, they just went, nah, we're alright I suppose. 3-litre V6 diesel, that's what people want, isn't it? Let's not bother with a hot one. And that, well, that's just disappointing. They still had the engine. There was space in the front of this to put it, because this V6 is basically the bottom end of a V8, but with V6 heads on it. No, serious, it really, really is. Here's a picture to show you what I'm talking about. And I suppose they maybe thought that, this is probably enough, 380 horses, it'll do for most people. And yeah, for most people it will, because put it into dynamic mode, the adaptive dampers will stiffen up, The steering will sharpen itself just a touch, become a little weightier. The gearbox then, put into sport or manual, is even more responsive, and when you want to have fun with this thing, you can. It is no Alpha Julia rival, this thing. The chassis isn't pin sharp, the initial turn-in is a little slow, and even in dynamic mode, the dampers are still set with an eye more on comfort than on keeping the thing flat and steady. But regardless, it is still a massively enjoyable car. That engine is tractable all the way through the rev range, right up to its 6,500 RPM limit. But it's maybe the gearbox which is actually the biggest surprise of all, because when you are on it and you're in the top half of that rev range, pull the paddle, which itself is a little plasticky and cheap, but it'll get that next ratio home with a nice satisfying little thump, and it'll feel almost, but not quite, like a DCT. This thing's fabulous, and it doesn't really have a shortage of pace at all, and so it'd be very easy to sit here and go, well, yeah, I get it, I see why Jaguar didn't bother, because for most people this would be all that they need. But there, right there, did you spot that mistake? That's what Jaguar got wrong. I think they looked at what people needed and forgot what they wanted. And there's a big difference between the two. I'll tell you what I do want with this car. I would like slightly wider and grippier tyres. You could have this either with 19s, as we have here, or with 20s. And if you went for the latter, you got 255 section tyres all round. With these, they're just 245s. This car is currently wearing the Jaguar specific Pirelli P0s. They got a few miles on, but still plenty of meat left on them. And though it's currently behaving itself, I have been warned that this car is desperately under-tired. When conditions are not perfect, as they are not today, it can get a little squirrely when it wants to. Haven't experienced it yet, but gonna keep one eye on that chassis. Other boring stuff, overall visibility is okay. The B pillar here is a little forwards, but it's not terrible. The A pillar is quite chunky. Ahead you've got actually a fairly good view of that nice bonnet. Behind you can also then see a good amount, and though I'm not fond of the material, I do appreciate the light coloured headliner in here and the two-tone interior, which just lifts it a little bit, makes it feel a bit more interesting. And while it's not as generous in space as, say, a BMW 5 Series, you have got room in the back for at least two decent-sized adults and a good-sized boot. It is still a wonderful combination of different factors, and at the end of the day, it's got the badge I like, though I prefer the one where the Jaguar itself is looking at you, all angry and stuff. So back then to this topic of want versus need. The thing about this car is that everything about it is just, well, it's nice. It's just really nice. It's a good, decent, handsome looking thing. But I don't think it's spectacular. I don't think it's sensational. It is certainly an evolution of that which came before, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But Jaguar have for a long time been experiencing a problem, which is that their cars are perceived as those of the old man. And the old man is, for a start, not really buying cars so much anymore, and secondly, if he does have a Jaguar, he's likely very happy with it, thank you very much, and he's probably got an XJ, and as they decided not to make a new one of those for the last 5 years, well, he's got no choice. He's certainly not going to take a step down. The young man then, and apologies to the 3% of ladies who watch this channel, well, they likely want a sexier, sharper looking, more overtly sporty car with that already mentioned really beefy engine, the V8 in some shape or form, which Jaguar made for the entirety of this car's life, more or less. It was only actually retired, I think, quietly this year, but I don't think anyone had been buying it for a while. They want something that's not going to fly under the radar so easily. They want something that's not going to blend in to the work car park. They want the M3, the M4, the C63, the RS4, whatever it is you want to compare this car with. And it always has been a bit of an odd car to compare, really, because technically these are a rival for a 5 Series, but in terms of their external dimensions, they're actually a little closer to a 7 Series. But for that, Jaguar have the XJ, or had anyway. This is a beautiful car to drive. The steering is nicely weighted, the adaptive dampers are sensational, that engine pulls so well. This car just does almost everything brilliantly. Letdowns, the infotainment, that wasn't brilliant even when it was new. Some of the materials in here aren't quite as nice as they should be. This should be a little bit nicer, as should this. And the dealers too. Harvey picked this up from a dealership down in London because they had the car that he wanted. He previously has had a succession of various different cars, from a Yaris T-Sport to a couple of 7th generation Celicas, a Fiesta ST Mark 8, but he decided that his family had had a few Jags in the past, he had fond memories of them, and he wanted one of his own. He looked at the XJ, but it didn't have the headroom he required. He tested an XE, found that it was similarly tight on space, and so he realised that the car for him was an XF without the sunroof. He wanted a decent, meaty engine, not the smaller turbos, and this one even does decent economy. Around town it's more like 20 to the gallon, but on a run it'll happily do 30s. He's put 19,000 miles on this car in the last 18 or so months too, including a big trip around Europe, so he uses his car. But unfortunately, his very first impression was not a particularly positive one, because when he went to go and collect the car, having given them ample notice, the front had plenty of stone chips in it, the headlining was dirty and marked, and he later found out the car was also overdue a fairly major service, what he called the service number 6, and actually the service number 5 too, so things like the spark plugs and supercharger belt were due and hadn't been done. Jaguar main dealer, and they wonder why they have the reputation that they do. But you see, I apologise, I've gone off on a tangent here, but hopefully an enjoyable and informative one. Harvey's an unusual chap because he was very much happy with this car, but the fact is a lot of other younger guys in their 20s, he's currently 27, they'd want something much sexier, much sportier, but they couldn't afford it. So they want the M3, but what they actually buy is a 320i or a 320d or something. But they bought the 320i or the 320d because the M3 exists, and that is as close as they can get to the car that they want. In recent years, we have seen this sort of subsection of cars, the M-Lights, so the M340i's, the C43s, the Audi S brand, which, okay, has existed for a while. They've done better business than ever before because they give people a little taste of what they want, slightly sexier performance, better looks, and the idea that they are better than everybody else, but without the price, the commitment of the full-fat cars. Oh, wow. Yeah, no, that little section back there, this car lost the front end. I was doing like 35 miles an hour through there, not on it in any way, shape or form, and this just let go. That was unexpected. I don't think these Pirellis are very good. I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that. Anyway, I think with a bit of help, a bit of dressing up, this V6S could have been a fine M340i equivalent. Give it 20-inch wheels basically as standard. Make it even sharper, even more aggressive looking. Make the exhaust a little fruitier. As it is, it's decent, but it's not spectacular. I like the sound of it, it's nice enough, but it's not sporty or raughty enough. And remember, this car came from 2015, 2016, when we could get away with really raughty, sexy exhausts. And Jaguar did some of the nastiest and naughtiest in the business, but they kept it for the likes of the F-Type. Why couldn't you inject a little bit of that into this? Have the XF Tributo F-Type. You know what I mean? I just don't get it. Tragically, I think Jaguar did back themselves into a little bit of a corner with this car because they designed it to take a V6 up front. I'm certain it would take a V8 with a little effort. I mean, heck, they put one in an XE after all. But that V8 did slowly get retired in favour of an all-new Jaguar-designed straight 6. And wouldn't that be a great rival for a BMW M340i? A nice, lovely Jag with a turbo 6 in it. Ooh, that'd be something. But I don't think there's room in the front of this for a straight 6, and I suspect that's why they never ever bothered selling it, because for the last, 6 years of this car's life, it was crying out for such a power plant. And the tragedy is that Jaguar at the time made what probably looked like the sensible decision. They focused on the nice diesel offerings, and so that's why the range topper was the diesel. From 2018 onwards, you wanted 6 cylinders, it was going to be diesel. That was it. But diesel, even by then, well, its reputation was shot. People didn't want to touch it anymore. So Jaguar really should have, as soon as they could, found a way to put a V6 petrol at least back into one of these, if not something a little bit better or spicier. And yet they never did. They effectively abandoned the model. And this is tragic because it means that today they're kind of forgotten about, because the vast majority of them on sale are either the diesel, which nobody wants, or the small petrol, which petrol heads don't really want either. It's not even that economical. And so I can come to really no other conclusion than the fact that Jaguar shot themselves in the foot, and needlessly so, because this is fundamentally a really, really good car. And that's a surprise to me, because this is not the first time that I've driven a Jaguar XF. A number of years ago, I drove an example of the facelift, the XF Sport Brake with the V6 diesel. And I really, really didn't like it. Remember I said earlier that I was very happy that I was driving this car? Well, part of the reason is because I also at the same time years ago drove an XE, and I didn't like it. But then a few weeks ago, I drove that older V6 XE, and I loved it. Not just for the engine, but also the chassis. The whole thing just worked. It felt like a Jaguar should. And this is exactly the same. Now, maybe it's partly the roads that I'm on today, maybe it's a bit of the passage of time, but I don't think so. This car feels much nicer set up, much better damped than the last one I drove. That one just felt far too stiff. It was very unpleasant. It was very, very compromised, and I couldn't really understand what Jaguar were trying with it. This, though, all of the different elements, they all come together and they all just work. And on that note, yes, I know Jaguar do not have the greatest reputation for reliability, but in the last 19,000 miles, Harvey has not had a problem with his car. And generally speaking, I think these are likely to be far, far better behaved than any with the turbo engine, especially the diesel one. Electronics always seem to be the weak point of these cars. In fact, I think it was the XE that I had the dubious distinction of being one of the only 2 press cars I've ever had, which has given me a serious issue. The other was an F-Pace, also electrical gremlins. This car probably deserved to do better, and it would have done, I think, if its manufacturer had just treated it right and maybe spent a little more on the model range as a whole rather than just focusing on the ones it thought people wanted. Jaguar, like many other brands, I think have completely overlooked and missed the importance of the Halo model. And that's a shame. But their loss is your gain, because today you want one of these, you can pick one up from just over £13,000. And I'm talking here about the V6S. As they were then only in production for a couple of years, the prices don't vary all that much, with plenty of really good examples being out there for about £16,000 to £17,000, and the absolute most expensive of them all, with very low mileage, £25,000. But I really don't think you probably need to spend that much on it. And so, there we go. That is a look at a Jag which really should have done better, but just didn't. What do you think though? Is my theory on the money, or have I got it wrong? Regardless, I want to say a big thank you to Harvey for bringing his car out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.